And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the powers of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power of the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heaven, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he know that his time is short. Okay, so I'm back. I've actually have a different translation of Enoch because it's a non-canonical text and it's gone through various translations. It's essentially up to the way the authors edit the book, where they set their chapter heading. So I went with my original source here. This is actually coming from chapter 9, okay, in this version. But I'll read the passage for you so you get an idea. And there's a couple different things in here I want to highlight, which will come up later. Some of this will be addressed immediately, but some of it will be content that we won't discuss as we get further into the video. But it says this, Look at what Azazel has done. He hath taught all unrighteousness on earth, and revealed the eternal secrets which were made and kept in heaven, which men were striving to learn. And Shemihaza, who taught spells, to whom you gave authority to rule over his associates. And they have gone to the daughters of men on earth, and have had sex with the women, and have defiled themselves, and revealed to them all kinds of sins. And the women have borne giants, and the whole earth has thereby been filled with the blood of unrighteousness. And now, behold, the souls of those who have died are crying out and making their petitions to the gates of heaven. And their lament has ascended and cannot cease because of the lawless deeds which were done on earth. Okay? So again, this is in the book of Enoch. All right. So, what are angels and what are devils? In these passages, we hear the term Satan used. We hear the term devil used. We heard the great serpent used. And then we have specific names when we get to a book like Enoch, Shemihaza, Azazel. There are many. Okay. Well, the reality of this, and this is where this gets complicated, is we don't exactly know. We get clues of things here and there, but the Bible, at least, never specifically tells us what a demon is. Okay. There are three primary theories that people have, and we'll look at each of those. And from there, people kind of just pick and choose which they believe to be the case. Some people may find that controversial, but let me actually break this down for you. Okay. So the most popular mindset around demons or the demonic is actually that they're fallen angels. Okay. So we know from the passage that I read in Luke, where Jesus is speaking to the apostles and he said, I saw Satan fall from the heavens. Okay. So this is that story of this being, this heavenly being who disobeyed God and was sent out of the heavens down to the earth. Okay. We get a similar story in John's Revelation, in the book of Revelation, regarding this great serpent, the devil, the Satan, being sent out. There was a war in the heavens. The archangel Michael was involved and was utilized to sort of defeat Satan and his army, which, according to the scriptures, was 1/3 of the heavens. Okay, so this is where this idea of fallen angels exists. Now, why this gets complicated is because it seems it's not quite that simple. I've discussed in other videos that the term angel is a very ambiguous term that essentially just means messenger or messengers. The term is malach. Um, it's utilized or called that because in the case when we have holy angels or holy watchers, as they're called, um, they tend to be the things God sends to communicate to humans. So you can think of Gabriel as probably the best example of this. But that doesn't seem to be their only function. And it doesn't mean that other people and things can't be messengers from God as well. There's prophets, there's priests, there's kings, things like this. But because that's sort of what we think about them being, we use that term angel. But it's a function of what they do, not an actual description of who or what they are. Okay. Either way, if we want to use that term, a watcher or an angel, there are some of these who clearly rebelled against God and were cast out. And this serpent, this devil, this Satan, he appears to be the head lead one behind this rebellion. Okay. Where this gets complicated is, as I've discussed in previous content, there is this term called B'nai Elohim, which is literally translated as sons of God. And these are spiritual beings that are in heaven with God and seem to participate in the involvement with the creative order. They're not gods themselves. They are creations that God created, but they do like all things, when God creates, he wants participation from his creation. They participate in this space he's created, which is the earth. Now, if you think of what we talked about in our last video, some of the passages I read, I read in Genesis, it's how it states clearly that when God created, he created the heavens and the earth. So he creates these two different spaces, okay? And one of them is the heavens and one of them is the earth. And it would seem that these entities are heavenly beings, but they're not the same type of heaven that God lives in. Okay. If you remember, I also read a passage on from Paul where he talks about him going to the third heaven. So the way that this usually gets broken down is you have obviously the earth and we have the sky, which is part of the earth. But that would be the first heaven, because we're speaking about the heavens. You can look out and that's the clouds and the birds and things like that. Then there's this other second heaven, which is created by God, which would seem almost like space. I mean, that's how I would interpret it. I mean, some people may have a different interpretation, but it would seem to be this sort of created space that's outside of our atmosphere, but that's still in the heavens. And then there's this third heaven, which is where God resides, which is somewhere even outside of that. Okay. So keep that all in the back of your mind as well. Beyond that, a careful reading of the Bible tells us that there's more than just B'nai Elohim, or who tend to be referred to as messengers, or who tend to be referred to as watchers. There's also these things called living creatures. Okay, we encounter these in multiple places. In the book of Ezekiel, we have the famed account he has on the river Chebar, where he sees these beings in these crafts, seemingly described as crafts that look like a wheel within a wheel, and he describes them in a series of ways, but they seem to be human, animal-like creatures, and they seem to be almost like have the ability to almost shapeshift. He has a difficult time kind of explaining what they are, but he knows that they're different. But he calls them living creatures, which is different from the B'nai Elohim or the angels, which would be spiritual entities. Okay. We hear about these also in Daniel. Okay, when Daniel has his vision, he also talks about these living creatures. Interestingly, in his account, they don't come from the sky in these craft. They come from the oceans. Okay, which is also really strange. And lastly, of course, if you've read the book of Revelation, John also, when he is having his revelation, where he enters into this sort of spirit realm, and he's standing at the throne of God, he sees not only the B'nai Elohim, he sees 24 elders, it says, which we don't know, but he sees these at least 4 living creatures that are sort of standing at the throne. And what we learn from the book of Ezekiel is those living creatures is what we actually, or I should say what the Bible actually refers to as cherubim. Okay, so this is something different. And when you actually read the scriptures carefully and you go back and look at the Christian tradition, they often will say the angels, the cherubim, and the seraphim. Okay, well, seraphim is a different order, which we don't exactly know what that is either, although it's called a fire serpent. So it's another type of living thing that looks like a serpent, that has fire, which sounds a whole lot to me like a dragon. I have proposed in previous videos, and this is just my opinion, that seraphim may be one of the types of cherubim, because we know that there's many different types of cherubim. They have a lot of different appearances. Some look like they're horned and they look like sort of oxen or goat-like. Some of them are more bird-like. Okay, some of them look more like mammals, like some type of like carnivorous mammal, whether it's a bear or a lion. So there's a lot of different descriptions. Some of them look like men. They're described as they look like man. So there's a lot of variation. We do know that the B'nai Elohim, the angels, are described as looking like men. Okay. We also know that in the book of Genesis, when God is speaking, he says, "Let us design them in our image." There's different opinions about that. Some people think he's saying "our" plural because it's the triune God and he's sort of like speaking about all his parts. But others have proposed it's because he's dialoguing with these spiritual beings, the B'nai Elohim, and he's allowing them to participate in this process. And therefore, when he's making these humans, he wants to make them in certain ways like these B'nai Elohim. So then we get to this thing. Well, what are the demons? Okay, are the demons the B'nai Elohim? Are the demons the cherubim and seraphim? Are they all demons? Okay, that's where it's not clear. And it never says in the New Testament that the demons are this or that. It just tells us they're there, and it talks about casting them out. Okay, it describes them as unclean spirits, which we'll get to. But at least one of the common assumptions around this is, well, they're fallen angels, but it may not be that that's exactly the case. The second thing that's often described or claimed is that demons are disembodied spirits. Well, this actually comes from Enoch. Okay, and Enoch is a very popular book in this subject matter because it seems to provide a lot of answers for many of the questions that people have had around this material. The problem is that it's not a canonical text for a lot of reasons. So it's not considered to be authoritative in the way that other texts would be. And there's no specific description in the Bible in the same way that Enoch describes these events. Now, there are overlapping stories. We do know in Genesis 6 that there is a story of the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, mating with the daughters of men, producing offspring. It says that the Nephilim were on the earth that day and after, so on and so forth. But it never really clearly states that these disembodied spirits of the Nephilim are what becomes demons. But a lot of people believe that's the case. And essentially the idea is, again, going back to Enoch, is that after God sends the deluge to wipe out the Nephilim, who are this perversion of his creation, because he never intended his B'nai Elohim to mate with the daughters of men, they create this third thing. And when that third thing, which is a hybrid or a giant, dies, its soul doesn't have a place to go because it was never part of the creation design. Okay, so humans, when they died, their soul has a place to go because it was designed by God. The angels or the spirit beings, they live in the spirit world, so they just have a place to go. But these hybrids get trapped, and that's part of the reasons why they're here, and it's part of the reasons why they're angry and they hate God. Okay, and in the book of Enoch, the Watchers, the fallen Watchers, are actually trying to get Enoch to sort of speak to God on their behalf and be like, "Hey, help us!" They're like trapped here. These are our children. These are the soul or the spirits and souls of our children, so on and so forth. It's a very interesting idea. It certainly makes sense, and it does help to put a lot of this in the context of what we encounter in the New Testament when Christ is on earth and he is casting out demons. But again, it's not actually in the scriptures themselves, and it never clearly states that. We just get it in this passage in Enoch. Okay, so keep that in mind. Lastly, people just talk about demons as malevolent spirits. Okay, well, that's certainly true. We know that whatever they are malevolent. Their intent is to do harm and to enact evil. In fact, the Bible tells us they come to kill, to steal, and to destroy. Okay, and that's what the devil comes to do as well. We know that they work with Satan, and they're a part of his army. But we don't really know. Were they just Perhaps there's many different types of spirit beings out there, and it's a very diverse spirit world. And some of those things chose through free will to disobey God, and some of them didn't. And that's where we get these sort of good guys, which we call angels, and bad guys, which we call demons. So we don't really know. Okay, but we have some ideas or some clues. Probably what we know more about, rather than their actual origin story, is kind of how they function. And that may be more helpful for our discussion. And that's what I want to get into in the next part of this video, which is discussing how they're actually described in the scriptures themselves. Okay, so there are actually several passages in the Bible. I won't have time to go through all of them, but I do want to hit on some key points. Okay, all right. So I'm going to kind of give you a list of names for different malevolent spirits, malevolent things in the Bible. And again, some of them may be qualified as B'nai Elohim or even devils. Some of them may be described as demons. Some of them may be the same thing. We don't know. Okay, again, getting back to this. But the first and most obvious is, of course, Satan. We get the term Satan many times throughout the Bible. Satan actually means adversary or accuser. Okay, that's what it literally means. And in fact, in its earliest usage, it's not a proper name. It's just like the accuser, like it's just a thing. But as time goes on, that title, the accuser, becomes a proper name for this entity, that guy who is the accuser. That becomes the Satan. So that's going to be important too in just a minute. Okay, probably the most popular name that people are familiar with is the name Lucifer, which does come from Isaiah. It comes in chapter 14, verse 12. But what a lot of people may not know about that is it doesn't actually say Lucifer in the text. What it says is light bearer or morning star, which gets translated into the name Lucifer. Okay, so again, it's not an actual literal name that's provided. It's a description of this thing that falls from the sky, the falling star, the fallen morning star, the Lucifer. Okay, there's another entity referred to as Beelzebub. Okay, this comes in the Gospel of Mark. This is chapter 3, verses 22. The term Beelzebub, actually, the front end of that is essentially a different or alternate spelling of Baal or Baal, who is a Canaanite pagan deity. And then Zebub means of flies or of the things in the air. So this is basically the Lord of the flies or the Lord of the things in the skies. He's also referred to as the Prince of Demons. So many people believe that this is actually the same entity as the Satan, and they're actually just a different name for the same entity. And this is where this all gets very confusing. Okay, if you keep going, there's another one, Belial, okay? Belial, probably not saying that right. It means lawlessness or worthlessness. Okay, this is a term that Paul actually uses in 2 Corinthians 6:15. Okay, and again, some people say, well, maybe that's just another alternate name for the Satan. Okay, there's Abaddon or Apollon, who is the angel of the abyss. This is the destroyer of worlds, and he's mentioned in Revelation 9, verse 11, just before we get to the passage I read to you already about this war in the heavens. There's Azazel, okay? Azazel's mentioned in Leviticus 16, but that's also the name of the primary entity that's mentioned in Enoch, which is also interesting, okay? In the book of Leviticus, the name Azazel is mentioned because during sacrificial practices, the Levitic priests would sacrifice one goat or ram to God, and they would send a second one, and it says they would place the iniquities of the people on that ram or that goat, and they would send it out into the wilderness to Azazel, which also seems to be a reference to the Satan. We know that when Christ comes to earth and he goes, after being baptized, he goes into the wilderness, right, to face the devil. So a lot of people correlate that with Azazel and Satan. And again, like I said, the book of Enoch does mention an entity by the name of Azazel specifically. There's the name Lilith. This is mentioned in Isaiah. This is chapter 34:15. But what a lot of people don't know about that is like Lucifer, the text itself doesn't say Lilith. What it says is a night creature or a screech owl. And what those terms have been translated into is the name Lilith, because that's what they mean. So the name it gets is Lilith because it's a night creature or a screech owl. And it seems to be this demonic presence kind of out in the wilderness. And it's associated with femininity. Now, there's other backstories to the person of Lilith, but those aren't in the Bible. They come from like the Talmud and some of the other traditions. Okay, there's Leviathan, who's mentioned as a sea monster in Job and a monster of chaos. Leviathan's also mentioned in Isaiah 27:1. There's the behemoth. Sorry. This is another creature of chaos mentioned in Job, which sounds very much like Leviathan. So is it a different creature of chaos? or is it just a different name for this same thing, the Leviathan? But all of these are related usually to chaos in the seas, okay, the oceans. There's Rahab, which is also, again, another chaos god mentioned in Job, and that's also mentioned in one of the Psalms, okay? Beyond that, we get names of pagan deities. Okay, so we know we get like Moloch. He's mentioned in Leviticus. We get Baal, who I've already mentioned. That's throughout the Old Testament. This is the primary god of the Canaanites. Okay, we get Ashtoreth or Astarte. Okay, this is a fertility goddess linked to the moon and other things that we hear about throughout the Old Testament. You get Shamash, who was related to the Moabites in Moab. You get Dagon, who is a reference and a god, a false god or a pagan god of the Philistines. Okay. Then in the New Testament, we get a lot of interaction with what we would call demons. Now, some people in certain traditions and certain belief structures might refer to all the things that I just described as either devils, okay, meaning they're of a higher order than demons, or even principalities, which we're going to come to in a minute, meaning that these are things that are bigger than just the sort of the ground soldiers, for lack of a better term, who become the demons, okay? Again, this is just a theory, but like I said, we don't really know. It's sort of just piecemealing text together and trying to make sense of it. But what we do learn in, for example, Mark, is that he tells a story in chapter 5, verse 9, about one particular demon named Legion, okay? And he's called that because he's actually, there's a demonic possessed man who has so many demons in him that there are many. Okay, so a legion is a Roman term for a Roman soldiers. They broke them up into legions. That's, by the way, the only time where a demon gives a name. And this will be a relevant conversation to some of the other videos I'm going to have later when we talk about the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, particularly around exorcism and deliverance ministry. So file that away for however you want to do it. There's also this spirit of Python or Pythia. This is a young woman who's basically possessed, and she's has the gift of divination, where she can sort of prophesy things. She's like a witch, and she's utilized by people for this purpose. It's very much the same type of story we get from Roman mythology regarding Apollo, who sort of conquers this python serpent, and then he sets up this temple in Delphi, and that's where the Oracle of Delphi comes in, and she's this witch who basically uses her connection to this malevolent demonic world to prophesy things, and people pay her or give her things in order to gain favor with her. But Paul has to cast this python spirit out of this woman who has this spirit of divination. Overall, that's in Acts 16:16. But overall, in most cases, they just refer to these things as unclean spirits. So we don't really exactly know what that means. Again, perhaps the interpretation we find in the book of Enoch is correct, and that these are unclean spirits because these are the spirits of dead Nephilim, and they're just trapped, and that's why they're unclean. But again, we never truthfully actually get a definitive answer. Okay, so when people tell you, oh, it's this or it's that, you have to be real careful because a lot of people have real definitive ideas about things, but when you really start to break it down, sometimes it's not as clear as maybe people might think. Okay, there's a couple other ones I want to mention. There's a reference to the Queen of Heaven. This comes from the book of Jeremiah. It doesn't tell us anything about the Queen of Heaven, but we do know that pretty much every culture and every tradition has some type of female deity. That's usually a very prominent figure within their pantheon of gods. Okay, so probably the Queen of Heaven was, where Jeremiah was living at the time. It was whatever that female entity was that they were worshiping. We don't really know, but that's another term that's given. And one that's gotten real popular lately, which is interesting, is actually called or is referred to as Jezebel. And this one is actually a bit more nuanced because Jezebel was not a demon or a spirit. This was a woman that was married to King Ahab. Their story is in the book of Kings. And she was known for being a very malevolent woman, and she was very crafty. And we later learned that, she was basically a witch, and she had certain probably demonic powers, not unlike the young woman who was possessed by the spirit of Python. But what's happened is people often refer to a Jezebel spirit. meaning it's a demonic force that's not unlike the demonic force, or maybe even the same demonic force that was affecting the woman Jezebel in the Bible. So Jezebel isn't the name of the actual demon or devil, whatever. It's the name of a woman who was demonically possessed, who had certain traits or characteristics. So that term also gets thrown around a lot, and oftentimes incorrectly. So I just wanted to clarify that. But most significantly, okay, what we're talking about throughout the Bible and throughout the tradition is that all of these different nation states had different entities they worshiped, and they made these their gods and their goddesses. And what the Bible tells us, and we're going to look at some passages here in a minute, is that all of these things were idols, okay? And they were all demons or devils, okay? Depending, okay? They weren't of God. They were false gods setting themselves up, and they are these malevolent spirits, okay? And they're tricking humans. So that's probably the most important thing we need to gather from this. As we move into the New Testament, we do get specific examples of that. So we talked about in the Old Testament, when we were looking at like the Canaanites or the Moabites, you would hear names like Baal and Shamash. When you get to the New Testament and you have like Paul traveling through different cities like Athens, which they worshipped Athena there. When he goes to Ephesus, we learn about a temple of Artemis, also known as Diana. Okay, Apollo was a very popular figure in first century Rome. He was worshipped and celebrated by a lot of the Roman Caesars. He's also the god over the Python spirit we discussed, and his name is eerily similar to Abaddon or Apollon, which is mentioned in Revelation. A lot of people have proposed that that's the same entity that John's referring to when he talks about this malevolent entity that holds the keys to the the pits of hell for whatever reason. Okay, so what do we do with all that? Well, we could drive ourselves crazy and try to figure out, is this person this and this person that and da da da. And there's actually people who do this. There's books out there. I have one right here. I'm gonna say. So this is called a dictionary. I don't know if you can see it there, of gods and goddesses, devils and demons. Okay, there's a lot of such books like this, and it's basically literally just a list of all these different terms. And interestingly, most of them are just the gods and goddesses of these quote unquote pagan cultures. Okay, but they're also directly linked to being devils and demons. Okay, throughout history. Now, it should also be stated that in these cultures, they viewed these entities as being benevolent because they gave them things, usually knowledge and power. Okay, and if we go back to Genesis 6 or the book of Enoch, we learn that that's precisely what these stories tell us, that these entities, which were fallen B'nai Elohim in this story, gave the human women knowledge and information in various forms in order to gain access to them. And therefore, the people liked these things. And this becomes the traditions of all these different religious cultures, and these become the entities and things that they're worshiping. But what needs to be remembered is that this is a very quid pro quo relationship. These entities are giving them certain information, but they expect things in return, okay? Which will be another subject of conversation later. Let me just consult my notes here to make sure that I haven't missed any of my points I wanted to make. We did mention the entity known as Shemihaza in the book of Enoch. So there's also a lot of demonic names or devil names that we get within the tradition. They may not be in the scripture itself. We don't really get any passage in the Bible that mentions Shemihaza, but Shemihaza is featured prominently in Enoch, which we'll talk about later. Asmodeus is mentioned in the book of Tobit, okay? And then Mephistopheles has become a name that's common with like a demonic spirit or demonic force. That comes from Dr. Faustus, the play by Christopher Marlowe, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare. But I believe he actually took that story from someone else, even before he got a hold of it. But that's probably how most people encounter that, is in the play, Dr. Faustus. Okay, I want to actually get back to the Bible, and then I want to get to my actual kind of key points about, and some sort of final thoughts on all this. Sorry, I'm bending down because I set my Bible down the ground. Okay, so here's some things we can actually gather about this, because a lot of this stuff so far has been informative to a certain degree, but there's still a lot of open ends. We still don't know a lot. We know there's a lot we do know and a lot we don't know. So I guess a better way to put it. I want to go to the book of Ephesians. And you're probably familiar with this passage because it's a very famous and often cited verse. This is in chapter 6, and it's basically verse 12. There's many, obviously, different translations of this passage, so mine may sound a little bit different, but it says this: "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places." Okay? This is Paul writing, and he's actually giving us a series of different things. He's not just saying one thing. He's saying there's several things. So in the first part, he says, we are wrestling against rulers. Okay, well, in many translations that says principalities. Okay, and then it says against authorities, or in some translations, powers. Okay, against cosmic powers over this present darkness, but then also spiritual forces that live in heavenly places. Okay, so again, we're getting actually a series of different descriptions, all of which relate to malevolent spirits. So are we talking about B'nai Elohim? Are we talking about or fallen B'nai Elohim? Are we talking about falling seraphim? Are we talking about falling cherubim? Okay, it's difficult to say, but what we'll see as we read through this is there does seem to be some type of hierarchical structure or power structure, which is a common thing you'll see when you encounter any writing or study on demonology. So let's talk about that in just a minute. Before I do that, I need to grab my Old Testament. So give me a second here. That's down here, because I want to look at a passage in Deuteronomy. This is Deuteronomy 32. And it's 32 verses 8 and 9. Okay, this is really tiny writing, so I'm going to have to squint here to try to read. But it says this. This actually, I'll start in verse 7. "Remember the days of old. Consider the years long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will teach you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance and divided the human race, he set the boundaries on the people according to the number of the people of Israel." Okay? That may sound weird, but hold on to that thought for just a minute. Okay, I want to keep going because then there's another verse here in the same chapter 32, which is verses 16 and 17, where it says, "They provoked his jealousy with foreign gods. They enraged him with detestable practices. They sacrificed to demons, not God, to gods that they had not known, new gods that had just arrived, which were your fathers did not fear." Okay, so in this passage, what it's telling us is that these nations, first, it's telling us this: that God's, when he after the Tower of Babel, essentially when he disperses humans, he sets up these principalities, and he puts spiritual entities in place over these territories. But what happened is some of them used their power for corruption, and they set themselves up as gods. And these things are the demons, the idols that become the gods and goddesses, right? If we go back over here to our dictionary, of all these cultures, okay? So interestingly, when we're talking about demonology, in many ways, we're also just talking about comparative religions. Because what the Christian tradition is saying, which is unique, is that there actually is only one God, and that everything else was created by him, and that some of those things that he created are good, and they actually will help you, but there's a lot of them that are bad. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to stand in place of God and trick humans into worshiping and serving them, okay? I think everyone gets the point with that, okay? So let's keep going. There's some other passages in here. Let's go to Corinthians. So this will be 1 Corinthians. Let me grab my New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we're going to go verses 20 and 21. "No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we evoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" Okay, so again, here we have in the New Testament, Paul also making the same points, which is all of those things that are posing as gods, are demons. Now, is a demon just a malevolent spirit? Is a demon the lost souls of the Nephilim? Is a demon the B'nai Elohim? Hard to say. But if we think that following the line of thought that when God put principalities over these territories, that these principalities were probably once B'nai Elohim, holy B'nai Elohim, then based on this passage in Paul, it would lead us to conclude that those are also demons, okay? Because he refers to them as demons. All right, I want to look at Psalms 96. This is a New Testament, but it actually does have the book of Psalms in it here at the end. So I am gonna, they just added it in there. 96:5, it says, wait, is that right? Psalms 96:5. This says, I don't think that's the right passage. I don't think that's the right passage. All right, either way, I'm not going to read that one. I probably wrote it down wrong. The point I'm trying to get, and there's other passages in the Bible that support this, is this idea again of God sort of stationing spiritual entities over territories, and that these spiritual entities, some of them or many of them, pose as false gods. Okay, so I don't think I even need to read that passage anyways. Okay, so where I want to go now is into an analogy, and then I want to voice some of my criticisms and concerns when I actually encounter this whole discussion on demonology, which I think will be relevant. So hold on here. But the best example we have of what I'm talking about in the physical realm is our current political structures. Okay, if you think how every nation across the globe has some type of boundary, some type of territory, and there's a political structure overseeing that territory, and that political structure is hierarchical, okay? And there's going to be usually like kind of like a supreme person, like maybe the president or the prime minister, or used to be kings or whatever. And this person is sort of the head and the sort of represents the all the other people underneath them that are servicing them. Usually, if you're a part of a political party and you're working underneath a political head, you're sort of working in their name. Okay, so like I'll use an example currently. Donald Trump is in office, and people will talk about the Trump administration. Well, Donald Trump is one person, but because he's the president, all the administrating bodies underneath him are oftentimes referred to as the Trump administration, or his cabinet, or his Secretary of State, or his vice president, because they're all working in coordination with him. It would seem that this is also how these principalities, these powers, these rulers were set up as well. And it also would seem that there is a overarching spirit that's guiding all of these things. Okay, the overarching spirit we know is malevolent in tone, but it tends to have certain characteristics. In fact, most of these religions have a model where they usually have like a primary god who's like a distant god, and then they usually have another male deity that's usually like considered like the son of that god, and then they usually have a female deity that's part of this sort of triad. And you find that in Egypt, you find it in Mesopotamia, you find it in Mesoamerica, you find it everywhere, and it's this sort of pattern. It's almost like how, even though every political structure at a localized level isn't the same, there is a certain pattern of structure usually within. Okay, and usually they're working together and they're colluding together, and they come in the other thing's name. I say all this because even when we look at the names given in the Bible for these demons or devils, depending on how we think of it, they're never actually truly proper names. They're names that describe what they do and how they're represented. So is this entity referred to as Beelzebub the same entity that's referred to as Satan or the devil? Truthfully, we don't know. But we know that there's a different amount of these things that are described, and they all tend to have certain characteristics. Like Beelzebub tends to refer to something that's ruling over the things in the skies. Leviathan seems to be ruling over the waters and the chaos there. Okay, a lot of the female deities usually relate to fertility in the moon. There's a lot of lunar deities. Usually the primary male god, whether it's Shamash or Baal or whomever, Amon-Ra, they're oftentimes linked to the daytime and the sun. Okay, so there's a lot of these patterns, but it's sort of like there's an overarching sort of spirit to this. And I think you have to be careful, because one of the things that starts to happen is people start to try to identify specific demons, and oftentimes we're not really in a place that we're equipped to know specifically this demon or that demon. And more importantly, we don't even really know that these larger sort of principalities are even the same demons that are possessing people. Okay. Um, some of the people that I've had the opportunity to interact with and dialogue with who were deeply involved in the occult um, will say that usually the demonic entities that they were interacting with were more like familiar spirits. Okay, the Bible actually talks about familiar spirits, so we will maybe hit on that in another video. But these are essentially the sort of almost like the soldier demons on the ground level who are monitoring spirits that are watching us all the time. And a lot of times it would seem that this is actually the actual demonic entity that is responsible for things like demonic oppression. Okay, it's probably not some type of principality on a grander scale. Okay, so I just mentioned that, and again, I can't definitively prove that because there's so much we don't know. But that's just sort of, I guess, my thoughts on this. Either way, for me, this can get into a very dangerous space because a lot of times people can get interested in this and they start reading books like this and they start learning all these different demons' names and they think that they're empowering themselves by gathering this information. But what they're actually just doing is another form of witchcraft. Okay. So if you know anything about any pagan practice, such as witchcraft, part of where they get their power from is learning different incantations, different visuals or veve or symbols that they create that are symbolic of these entities, or even they name names. They call forth or conjure up certain names, and in doing that, it actually invokes power, okay, in the spirit world. So there's this idea of knowledge as power, which is what? Gnosticism. Okay, it's the same thing again. It's humans trying to manipulate and control things through knowledge and information, and then have and use that power for their own gain. Now, in the Christian sort of space of exorcisms and deliverance ministry, some people think that, well, by having more information about the demonic entity that we're facing, we're better equipped at how to address the problem. I do not think that is true. I think that that's incorrect. And I think that when you start to do that, you're actually just trickling into this sort of occult space. Okay. It also reminds me of other occult practices, things like astrology, right? Where you learn the different zodiac signs, and then once you know that, you can sort of like, oh, you're this or that, and it gives you this sort of power or knowledge you can sort of project on things. Or another example you may think of is even like tarot cards. So if you think of like in tarot cards, there's what's called the major arcana, and they're essentially just a series of different things, like a king, a queen, a hierophant, whatever. All of these are just sort of what Carl Jung would call archetypal imagery. And then that's what the practitioner is putting down and utilizing to read a person's whatever. Um, do their tarot reading and give them predictions about how to live their life and so on and so forth. But it's all about assigning power to specific things and names and symbols and ideas. And the danger with something like talking about demonology is there is a propensity for people to want to do that same thing with the demons. Okay, and here's where you have to step back, because in the Bible, when God is talking about casting demons out, there's no passages where he says you need to know what type of demon you're dealing with, or what the demon's name is, or where it came from, or why it's there. None of that, because as I read in the passage of the scripture, which will now be relevant, we've been given authority to tread on the head of all serpents and scorpions. Sorry about that. My technology's betrayed me today. I got a warning on there that my file was getting too large, so I had to go make some space on my phone. So that's why it crashed there a little bit, but I am back, and it does appear that I have the previous part of the video that I already recorded. But to just kind of finalize things, because this has gone on for fairly long, yeah, you have to be careful with this stuff. And there is a propensity to want to learn about this and go down these wormholes and learn about all these different names of these different entities, Leviathan and Belial and Beelzebub and Mephistopheles and Shemihaza. And the truth is, outside of the book of Enoch, which again is non-canonical, the Bible doesn't tell us much. And I think that that's probably intentional, right? If the point is, hey, all that other stuff out there is bad and it's leading you astray. You need to come back into focus and focus on the actual one true God and dismiss all of this stuff. You're not going to want to spend a lot of time detailing all this other stuff. Remember, these people would have been inculcated in these cultures. They could not escape Diana. They could not escape Apollo. They could not escape Baal or Shamash. So they knew everything they needed to know. The Bible doesn't need to give that information about who and what these things are. Every tradition had its own answer. Now, was what they told them the truth was the actual truth? Well, that's a different question, because we know that the devil tells riddles, and sometimes he tells truths in the form of lies, and sometimes he tells lies in the forms of truth, but he is what? The great deceiver. So it is possible that a lot of the stuff that people would gain from these esoteric traditions, whether it was the pagan religions of old or whether it's contemporary occult practices, may in fact be true. But which parts are true and which parts are lies is very hard to say. And that brings the other sort of, let's say, wrench in this wheel. You'll find most of the information that you're going to garnish that's really detailed and involved, and it provides some type of systematic analysis of a lot of this stuff related to the spiritual world and demons specifically, actually comes from the occult. Or if I always say, if the devil's working this hard, you must be doing something right. I'm having phone issues. It keeps shutting off. I just extended my iCloud storage. So hopefully, third time's a charm and I can get through this. But I was going to say that I know that in the Catholic tradition, particularly exorcists, tend to have a sort of pantheon, or almost like a hierarchical order of how they view all these different demonic names and demonic entities. Some of that does come from the Bible. A lot of it comes from tradition. Some of it comes from their own experience, where they are casting demons out and they're asking the demon its name. Okay. We will talk a lot more about that in another video. But my perspective on this is, like I said, and I'll reiterate because I don't know where in these videos how they're all going to come together when I go back and edit. The devil's a master of lies. So, we have to be very careful what we think, what information we think we're getting from them, and whether that's a religious tradition and how they view their various gods, or whether it's an occult practitioner and how they interacted with these spirits, or whether it's even a person within the Christian tradition who is working to cast out or eradicate demonic forces and is forced to interact with them. The information that they're given should always be taken with a certain grain of salt. Okay, if that metaphor works there. With a grain of salt, I think is the actual phrase. This video has gone on long, and because my phone's having issues, I'm going to end it here. But we will come back with more videos, and we will tackle the subject matter in more depth. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and we'll be back soon, sooner than later. Have a great day.